Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Female Founder Series. I'm here today with a very special guest. I'm very excited, actually quite awestruck to have Pam O'Connor here, who is the former CEO of the leading real estate companies of the world, the largest and really only notable network for independent brokerages. So Pam, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Rachel. It's fun to join you. Appreciate the invitation.
And I mean, I'm curious. I'm sure we're going to talk lots about sort of how you got to where you are. You've been retired for just a couple of years now. And, can you tell us how you got into the real estate industry and how you sort of initially had the idea for leading real estate companies in the world?
Yeah, sure. Well, as with most people, it was sort of accidental. When I was getting out of college, that was back when women were either nurses or teachers or nuns or secretaries, and I wasn't cut out to be a nun or a nurse or a teacher. So I found a job. My degree was in journalism, and I ended up going to work for a television station, WSB in Atlanta, and as a secretary. But it was a fun job in that I worked for a woman who ran the promotion department, which was the department in those days that dealt with all the celebrities who came through town. So I would bring coffee to people like Burt Reynolds and Bob Hope and John Wayne. And so it was a really fun job for a kid right out of school. But I recognized, I think just instinctively, that if I stayed in that job, I would always be in that. I wouldn't really have the opportunity to move up, and I wanted to do that. So I ended up, one of the guys I worked with was good friends with a man who worked for one of the early real estate networks called All Points Relocation. And so I ended up working there as a junior kind of communications / marketing manager, and did that for about 6 years. And then, so it was really accidental, and I wasn't certainly selling real estate, but definitely working with this network of real estate companies. And then I left and went into another area of real estate, multifamily marketing, for a few years. And then All Points approached me to come back to be their CEO. And I was only 35 at the time, which I thought they were crazy, even thinking I could do that job. But I took it, and so the rest is history. So that's how I ended up in this wonderful business of ours.
That's wonderful. And I mean, congratulations on that, on the success you saw, and also being able to have the sort of courage to not follow the path that was set out for you or you were expected to. Mm-hmm. I'm curious, how did you get from All Points to leading real estate companies in the world?
Through a series of consolidation steps. So let's see, I guess I was into when I went back to All Points, a lot had changed in the industry. So it's one of those things that, had I realized that the business had changed, and without going into why, but there were a lot of things that were different, I probably wouldn't have gone back. So it was a good thing I didn't know, because it was, but bottom line is the network had lost a lot of ground in the time I've been away. So a lot of my work there was really rebuilding it. And so it was, we were in a good place. We didn't have the largest companies, but we had really good quality companies. And then another large network called Relo decided that they were interested in purchasing us. And my wonderful board told them, yes, we'll consider that, but only if you make Pam the CEO. So I was very blessed to have their support. And so I morphed into Relo, and that's when I moved to Chicago. And then about probably a year after that, a new organization was formed, which was later became Leading RE, but the initial name was Reliance Relocation Services. And it was basically, it had been formed by a lot of the large independent brokerages who had been part of what today would be Realogy Cardis, their independent broker network. And so they decided to form this new enterprise. They partnered with another network called Genesis, and then I was approached to be their CEO, and that would have been going across the street to the competition, which I told them, and they said, well, what if we put them together? And that's what happened. So they merged the Relo network into these others. So it really, in a sense, we brought 5 different networks under one umbrella in the space of a couple of years. And so I was very fortunate to be given that opportunity to manage it.
So you used the word accidental a couple of times, and I want to go back, listening as you're telling your story. You had your board advocated for you. You had people who were sort of advocating for you to go
Mhm.
to lead these companies. And I'm curious, to what do you attribute that success and being able to get people behind you? And what was it like being a woman who was in your position and having to get those people behind you then?
Um, well, I've always said we all have a core value, something that is the one thing we'll go to the mat for, no matter, and it's different for different people. Mine has always been relationships, and it's something, that I love people, and that sounds so, la la valley girlish, but I really do value relationships, and I work hard at them, and I think really every major opportunity I've had in my life was because of those relationships. So, in the case of, when I was brought back to All Points, that was less. It was in large part about the relationships I had with the board there, but it was also about performance. So the other piece of it is performance. So those two things, relationship and performance. And I'm not your typical bra burning Gloria Steinem era women's liver, even though I grew up in that environment. My mother was widowed at a very young age. I had a very strong, wonderful mother, and she taught me, do not be a victim. And I have a huge issue with people that constantly blame, their gender, whatever their situation in life is, for their problems, because you always have choices. And I really believe that you make your own luck. And so I, when I went into the position with All Points as their CEO, it really didn't even dawn on me, to be honest, for a year or two, that I was the only woman in that role, and in the across the real estate business. And I had good role models in my mother and my former boss at WSB. I worked for good men who were, in many cases, very strong personalities, very strong type A personalities. But in real estate, if you add value and you make them look good and you bring something to the table that produces results, then you get ahead. And that's the nature of any commission-based business. But even though I was a salary person, I think that's really what it was. So when I actually got the offer to take on the Reliance job, and that was when it was first started. And then when we merged with Relo, we were called Relo for a while. And then about 5 years later, we changed the name to Leading Real Estate Companies of the World. But when I was offered that job, the gentleman who called me, who was a very well-known person, and actually you would know, well, maybe not you since you've been in the business that long, but a big name in New England, Dick DeWolf, who sold his company later to NRT Realogy. But he's the one who called me, and I'd only met him one time, and I thought, what in the world? He's calling me and basically offering me this great job over the phone. And so after I'd been in the role for a few months after the thing had come together and had closed, I was talking to him one day, and I said, I have this question. I said, I do not understand what possessed you to offer me this job when you didn't even interview me, you didn't know me. And he said, well, you're right, but he said all of our relocation directors knew you from your industry activities, and they all said, here's the person you have to hire. So that was a huge lesson to me. And I don't mean that you work on relationships because of what it'll do for you, but if you just never know when you plant those seeds with different people who might have some impact, on your career later. So I just believe in delivering value, and and in whatever way it is. And if you're in an environment, I've always told my young female friends, if you're in a place that doesn't appreciate you, that you are doing all the right things and you're not getting anywhere, then maybe you're not in the right place, and maybe you need to go somewhere where you will kind of have those people. So um, I think women would do much better to really think about it in those terms than to, constantly sort of, oh, woe is me because I was born female instead of male. I mean, it's there. We have a lot of wonderful qualities as women that, being nurturers, being relationship people, being multitaskers, a lot of things that really serve us well in leadership roles. And if people would just focus on what they do well and work at it, then I think the rest will come.
Well, I love that. There's a lot of good advice in there and wisdom, from the nuggets about your mindset to the fact that it is a really small world. And I'd love to talk about that a little more because leading real estate companies of the world you grew it to this global network covering dozens of countries and the largest companies in the world. So, to what do you attribute that success? What do you think really enabled you, and what did you focus on to take it from where it was to really this
Well, yeah, I would love to tell you, Rachel, that I was so brilliant, but that's not the case at all. First of all, the gentleman who really, and I say gentlemen because they were pretty much mostly men, brokers who decided to do this, were very courageous in that most of them walked away from a lot of business that they were getting from the old PHH, which later became Cardis, which is owned by a relocation business. So in some cases, I think Long and Foster walked away from something like 10,000 transactions a year. So it was a very courageous move for them to do that. And I was fortunate enough to then become part of that. But I think the reason that we did as well as we did was because we weren't listening to the conventional wisdom. And that's another lesson through the years that I've learned, because everybody in those days was saying, this was late 90s, was saying franchises are the future. You may as well go roll up in bed and go to, go in a cave if you're an independent broker, because there's no future there. And so we did the opposite. What we felt was there are a lot of good independent brokerages out there, but there's something that they're missing, which is something to tie them all together. And so we saw, kind of a void there, and we set out to fill it. And we originally were really focused more on the relocation broker to broker referral end of things, and that still is a major revenue stream for the network. But we also began to offer a lot of other services, so that really, over the years, we became sort of the unfranchised. So we offered a lot of what franchises offered, but without the branding, the national branding. So I guess, trying to figure out if there's a need there, and instead of going with the flow where everybody else is going, being the contrarian, so to speak, is probably one of the things that I would attribute the success that we had to. And it's also recognizing opportunities, because things pop up, and I was never one. I have a daughter who's she's been very successful. She's young, she's 29, but doing very well, works for HBO in New York, and she's very focused. And I kind of laugh sometimes. I think I was not that way. I was certainly ambitious, but I was more the kind of person that I knew when I came to the fork in the road which fork to take, but I wasn't necessarily plotting it all out in advance the way she does. But I think that if you keep your eyes tuned into, what is missing out there, what need isn't being met. And so in our case, one of the early things that, after we transitioned our brand, because the reason we changed the name to Leading Real Estate Companies of the World, or we used to shortcut call it Leading RE, of course. But the reason we did that was because Relo really didn't describe what we were anymore, because we were doing a lot of things in the real estate area as well as relocation. And so that was the main reason. I used to have to explain to people for 5 minutes what Relo was. But then when we changed our name and people made fun of us because it was such a long name, I said, yeah, but once you say it, they know what you mean. But anyway, when we went down that route and we started adding different products and services, and we realized that we really needed to be global, and that there was, a need for that. And I think Remax, ERA were the only two, that C21 maybe, that had been, doing that, but they've done it in a very different way, where they would go sign master franchisors in these different, countries around the world. And we decided we were going to do it just kind of onesies and twosies at a time, but really be selective and create relationships there, just as we had in the U.S. So that was, again, kind of a need that nobody was meeting. And I used to have a lot of my friends in the franchise world call and say, well, we need a broker for a referral in Italy or someplace, and their networks couldn't help them. So that's really it, identifying just opportunities as they come up.
hmm Well, I love that. And I want to talk about the sort of independent versus franchise in a minute. But before we get to that, I'm curious, now you're retired, and I'm curious if you're still, I would imagine you're still connected with your network and sort of what you're seeing and hearing, if you see opportunities for your former members, your former
Uh-huh.
network in
Yeah,
the
yeah,
fear
yeah,
of COVID,
yeah,
of global
yeah.
pandemic.
Well, no, I'm actually still working. I never planned to totally retire. I just retired from my day job because I had a wonderful guy who is now who's my successor and good friend, Paul Boomsma, who, I felt like, he's going to, at some point he needs to have this opportunity, and the time was just right to do that. I was ready to kind of move on to other things. So I work probably 35% of my time on different clients, on consulting kinds of things. But with respect to this last kind of COVID thing, Leading RE has actually done very well, and that's in large part due to Paul's leadership. But they've actually had a record recruiting year, ironically, in all of this. I think they've added 30 or 40 new companies, many of them in other countries. I think they've added 6 or 7 new countries. Their referral business has actually been good because in the early stages of the whole COVID shutdown, the the two big advantages that I sort of observed there were, number one of the biggest hurdles for brokers has always been the lack of technology adoption by their agents. And so that's a huge problem. They put all this investment into that, and then they can't get the agents to use it. And the COVID shutdown really forced that a lot. So that was actually a plus that will reap, dividends for a long time to come, I think. The other thing is that it kind of was this lull in the business where people, well, what do I do? And so one of the things that the better brokers did was to just get on the phone and talk to their agents and to kind of reignite those relationships. And the smart agents did the same thing with clients because they're always too busy to follow up with their past, clients and so forth. So I think those relationships kind of blossomed during those early stages. And then the other sort of unexpected silver lining was that, good or bad, depending on where you're coming from, was that there was a lot of movement because people, either because they needed, they were going to be working at home and needed more space, or wanted to get, out of their close quarters in the cities. There came a lot of movement that came out of that, which has been very good for a lot of real estate markets, including some that were really languishing there for a while. Now, the flip side of that is the cities where I'm trying to sell a condo and haven't been successful, and something that would have sold like, in a few minutes a year ago. But anyway, it will at some point. So I think all of those are sort of the silver linings, but the real estate sector of the economy, I think, has done very well and is going to continue to do very well. Home building is up. I mean, everything across the board. So, and there's still such a shortage of inventory that, if there's a downside to all of this, it's just, the affordability issue is still a problem because people, fewer listings, prices are staying stable or going up, and it's hard for younger buyers to really, get into the market. And I think you asked me something else, but I lost track of what it was.
That's okay. I'm curious. I mean, because it's wonderful, obviously, to hear from you too. How strong the LRE network is doing, and is. And I'm curious, with that, because there has been a lot of talk about franchises versus independents
Mhm,
and
mhm.
what independents need to survive in sort of today's climate, other than a pandemic that
Yeah,
boosts
yeah.
agent adoption and and,
Right,
and
right,
makes
right.
their market
Yeah,
strong. So
yeah, yeah.
what else do you think independents need, and do they have everything they need?
Well, I think the biggest, when people ask me, what the advantage of independence versus franchises are, and don't get me wrong, I have a lot of good friends in the franchise world, and so it's what works for different people. But I think that the big advantage that independents have, in a word, is freedom, because they have the freedom to operate their businesses as they want to. They have the freedom to deploy their revenues, their resources rather than sending a big franchise fee off to, some headquarters. They can use that money as they need it in their local market for technology, for marketing, whatever it may be. And they have the freedom to build their own brand instead of someone else's. So at some point, if they choose, if somebody were with one franchise and became unhappy, they may have built that brand and now they've got to start over again with somebody else. So those are, I think some of the advantages. But I will also say, self-servingly to some extent, that there's a huge advantage to being part of something like Leading REV, because that gives you not only some of the resources that you might otherwise get with a franchise, but I think or more importantly, the camaraderie, the being in a tribe, so to speak, with like-minded brokers and agents who who share a lot of the same values and so forth. So there's I think that kind of element. But as far as going forward, I think what the two things that I think are important to every brokerage, so this doesn't apply only to independents, is good leadership, which, if you put two companies side by side, there are great franchise companies, there are great independent companies, and the common denominator is great leadership. And that sounds sort of obvious, but leaders who are, who have a vision, who have good values, who are consistent, who treat people well, who really practice all the principles of great leadership. They're the kind of people that you want to follow. So leadership is one of the things that I think they all need going forward. And I think the other thing that is really missing in real estate, and has been as long as I've been in it, is more of a long-term focus. So it's a very transactional business. Agents are busy and they're commission based. So they're worried about the transaction that's closing next month or next week, not necessarily what's coming down the pike. And so, the ones that are most successful are always looking ahead and filling that pipeline and thinking what I need to do next to remain competitive and so forth. And by the same token, brokers, some of them tend to always, they're thinking about how we're doing this year, how we're doing compared to last year. And certainly they're always looking at new ways to tweak the business. But there are so many, for example, that don't ever think about succession planning. What happens to make sure this company survives when I'm not around anymore, when I'm, don't want to do this anymore. And that's what I mean by having more of a long-term focus. So I think that's an area that the industry in general could be working harder on.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that too, because earlier when you were talking about your leadership style, you talked about combining the relationship building strengths with the performance and results that you delivered. Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious today, if you were to look at the most successful companies or leaders you work with, what information or data they're using that's their sort of North Star, and what kind of performance they expect. And if there were a set of, I know this real estate agents don't love looking at data, but if there were a set of goals or metrics that you'd say, these are the things you always have to pay attention to, what would those be?
Well, I think that, the best leaders and the best operators tend to be curious by nature. So they're always kind of looking around, they're reading the industry trades, they're reading the general business publications, they're going to conferences where these things are discussed. They're talking not only to their colleagues, a lot of, one of the things that I think has been most valuable to a lot of brokers are these little CEO groups where they're with, non-competitors in other markets, and they come together a couple times a year and just share ideas. And that's of huge value because, usually there's some commonality and even in different kinds of markets. And so they learn from each other. The good ones also follow what their competitors are doing, because you can learn a lot from good competitors as well. As far as industry things, again, biased, but I think at Leading RE, we really put a lot of effort into our conferences because we felt like that was an opportunity to bring great talent to a platform, once a year, and actually more than that if you count our global and other regional conferences, and really give people an opportunity to hear the best of what was going on out there. So there's that. In terms of other industry things, I don't know. I used to watch this, and I think a lot of my broker friends did as well. Zelman is a really good resource if that's something you're not familiar with. There's a company, Zelman and Associates, that does a lot of great research in the housing sector, not just in resale brokerage, but in housing builders, mortgage companies, anybody to do with the housing sector. And they have great research. So in fact, I think today is they have an annual conference that's virtual this year going on. So I know a lot of my colleagues in the business world in real estate look at, some of their research. And, there's some other, Stevens is another one where they publish, I get their emails every day of what's going on with some of the public companies in real estate. So those sorts of things. Inman is a good source. I think they usually have a lot of good data. Mike Del Prete is another one who's done some great white papers on what's happening with portals and iBuyers and so forth. So there are a lot of places you can look, but I guess the key is to not be part of some group thing. I think we don't have enough independent thought nowadays across the board in the world right now, that people listen to one cable station versus another, and they hear that and they don't really think, I like one thing there, but I don't like that. And I like one thing here and I don't like that. And so maybe putting it together and forming their own conclusions instead of kind of being like little sheep, which I think there's too much of out there. So anyway, that I think the best, I don't know that there's any one source or, metric, but some of the best brokers I know didn't even do budgets, which is kind of hard to even imagine. But I do think that there's a certain discipline that is very valuable in terms of going through a business planning process every year and having budgets. And we always did that sort of backwards. So we'd start with, what is the big outcome that we want? Whether it's, a profitable, successful network where we're growing every year, whatever it might have been at a really high level. And then, what are the different strategies or programs or policies that it's going to take to make that happen? And then within each of those, sort of, what are the activities? So that's where my to-do list would come in, all the things that, and we were pretty religious about that at Leading RE. In fact, early on when shortly after we were formed, and I remember coming to our board with one of these the first time, and one of them says, "Oh, I wish I had that in my company," but that was just sort of the way I learned to do things, and there's real value in that. And so we'd follow up. We were pretty good about monthly looking, where are we in terms of what the plan is. So if that's what you're asking, I think that some of that discipline is, the brokerage business has changed a lot. It used to be, people always talk about mom and pops, but independent brokers are not by definition mom and pops. There are a lot of companies in all facets that you could call that, but they've all had to become a lot more knowledgeable and sophisticated and disciplined because they're competing with, in some form or fashion with the Zillows of the world or the Cardises or the public companies that are out there. So, that's what makes them so wonderful and resilient.
Well, there's a ton there. Thank you, Pam. I think so much advice and wisdom, and you kind of answered my next couple of questions about how you always seemed to know what the next big thing was. And you talk about staying curious. I can see your bookshelves behind you, so I'm curious if you have any book recommendations. What some of your favorites are that maybe.
Well, I can't go there right now because most of them right now have to do with the election, and I'm not gonna bring that one up because it's a sure no-win situation depending on which side you're on. But no, probably my favorite business book of all time was Good to Great. Jim Collins, I think, is Patrick Lencioni is another author I really like. And I still have, actually, I'm embarrassed to say, books on my bookshelf that I bought that I haven't read yet. So I'm getting through those a little bit more in having a little bit more time on my hands. But I think the big thing really is to, it's very easy to let yourself get pulled down by negativity out there. There's always going to be, I used to say this was the Chicken Little business, because the sky is always falling somewhere along the line. And, depending on where in my career I look back on, it could have been franchises, or it could have been the advent of the internet. It could have been third-party relocation companies stealing business from brokerages, you name it, and or Zillow or whoever it might be. And the reality is that none of those are going to bring you down unless you allow them to. So you're always going to have new entrants into the market. And I love to talk about years ago when we had Merrill Lynch and Metropolitan Life and Prudential and all these big companies, none of whom are in the business anymore. So it's not an easy business. And I think people really underestimate that, other than the brokers who are in it and have dealt with it for a lot of years. So it's, even whether it's now iBuyers, people have to realize we're in a very diverse world with a lot of different kinds of agents, a lot of different kinds of consumers, and they don't all want the same thing. And so there's always room for a lot of different business models and things that work for different people. And I think the real key is to know what you're good at and to focus on that. And there will always be a piece of the pie that you'll be able to capture. So that's, it's not so much, it's not brain surgery to, none of us has a crystal ball, but I do think, going back to looking where the voids are and doing what you do well and not being intimidated by the next gorilla that's coming down the path, believing in yourself, all of those things, those are, it's just good business,
I love it. Well, from one of the best leaders the industry has ever seen, thank you so much, Pam, for being on our Female Founder series. For everyone else, this is Pam O'Connor, former CEO of the leading RE. I'm Rachel Allard with Union Street Media, and stay tuned for our next one.
Thank you, Rachel.